Yeah, everyone. Very good morning, USA. Very good evening, Sri Lanka. Dear students, welcome to the Astro Week under the Astrobiology and Paleontology Certifications Program by Archaeoastronomy Inc. On behalf of the today's program, we are honored to welcome Mr. Bernie Taylor, a distinguished naturalist, archaeoastronomer, authors, hosts, and researchers. Explore mythological connections and biological knowledge among the prehistoric indigenous and the Asian people. His work in this area include a biological time in 2004 and before Orion, a find in the phases of the hero in 2017. Also, he is a member of the Archaeoastronomy Inc. Renowned for his groundbreaking research into the mythological and biological wisdom of Asian civilization, Mr. Chow will present a captivating lecture, a rethinking Stonehenge humanity's endurance and connections to the cosmos. While Stonehenge is very famous for the eclectic alignments, Mr. Taylor will develop a deeper explorations why prehistoric culture held in terms of the years in such a high regard beyond the ceremonial purpose. Drawing from the archaeological and anthropological records, he will traditional in our core biology and the psychology and revealing their profound significance in our shared human heritage. So today, join us for an enlightening exploration of the timeless beyond between humanity, sun, celestial spheres, and everything. With that being said, I would like to invite one of our best archaeoastronomer in the Equestrian Agency platform, Mr. Bernie Taylor, to address our students. Dear Bernie, now it's your time. You can get started.
Thank you for the patient and everybody staying up late this night. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen,
Okay.
practice this. Okay, perfect. So this title of this program is Rethinking Stonehenge. This is a project that I've been working on for 20 years. 20 years. I visited Stonehenge 2005, and I started to write a book that I never finished because I went into other things. But I retained a lot of information I'd like to share with you today, and I built on. First of all, we think of Stonehenge. There's many elements to the monument. It's prehistoric monument. And there's holes that surround the stone, so-called Stonehenge, called the obelisk. There's 56 chalk pits, and I have no opinion on the chalk pits. There are also so-called sarsen stones. The sarsen stones are really big stones. And the sarsen stones, they have caps and they have supporting stones. And the caps, I believe, are called lintels. And they're really they're massive, truly massive. But we should really look at Stonehenge in the context of prehistory. Where does it stand? So Stonehenge is about the same time period as a great period of Giza. You look at the Giza, you say, well, that's huge. That's absolutely huge. Stonehenge isn't that huge. Okay, so that's an important concept. So Stonehenge was it the biggest and the greatest of its time? You could say, well, the Giza pyramid are blocks and standing stone, not the standing stones at Stonehenge, but there are megaliths like Stonehenge that are earlier in time, such as Gigantea at Malta. So almost 1,000 years early to Gigantea at Malta. Important concept. And many thousands of years before that is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. So to put Stonehenge into context, it's not something new. It's not something new at all. And so one could say that whatever people had, in times before Stonehenge, such as Gigantea and other megaliths at Malta, as well as Göbekli Tepe and other tepes in Turkey, one could possibly have at Stonehenge. And indeed, of what knowledge people had at the Great Pyramid, perhaps they had at least some semblance of the same at Stonehenge. The sarsen stones come from the English countryside. And if one walks around, you can see these sarsen stones. Now, most of the area in English countryside is cleared of sarsen stones because it's active farming. And this, we're looking at the standing sarsen stones at Stonehenge from the perspective of the heel stone. And this heel stone is the only standing stone that's offset from the Stonehenge monument. And the heel stone, you can see that it has what's that? You don't know. We can see the heel stone as marked by the yellow arrow. It's an odd rock to use. I don't believe that the rock was chosen by accident. I believe that the rock has some sort of meaning. I don't know what it is. But I would think that if you had such an important stone as the so-called heel stone set off in the monument, if you wanted perfection, you would have chiseled it down. You'd have broken it, made it more finer without all the knobs and the holes. Hang on a second. So I need to move now to my next slide. I'm locked. There we go. Okay. There we go. There's also the blue stones at Stonehenge, and originally there were 80, and there's 43 remaining. The blue stones are about as tall as my chin, up to about my chin. And they are more closer to our time than the sarsen stones. The blue stones come from Wales, from 140 miles or 225 kilometers away. So people traveled a long distance to bring the blue stones to Stonehenge. And how they did it was by rafting them in and out of the bays and up the river, up and down the rivers. And how this is known is that these stones are found in the bottom of these bays. So not every blue stone made it, and these blue stones were found at the bottom of these can be found. Therefore, that was the transportation. It was not across land. They rafted them, which makes a lot of sense. There's also the altar stone at Stonehenge, which is between two collapsed sarsen stones at present. People look at the collapsed sarsen stones and think that's the altar stone, but it's not. The altar stone comes from Scotland, far to the north of Stonehenge. Now, those of us with Scottish blood in our veins have always known this. We've always felt this, but it took archaeology some time to figure it out. But they traveled quite a distance, and again, it was probably by water. And then there's the henge, and the henge is the dugout area that surrounded the monument. And I have no opinion on the henge itself. In 1965, an American, Gerald Hawkins, came on the scene. And Hawkins was an astronomer. And he said that this is all about astronomy. So why would Hawkins think this about astronomy, whereas the archaeologists and anthropologists at Stonehenge not even think about this? And the reason is that the excavations of Stonehenge and all of the work began before modern archaeology and anthropology. So people were using just ideas that they had about art history and what they thought about ancient peoples, but that's how Stonehenge was originally looked after. It wasn't looked at for other lenses such as archaeology. So archaeology didn't exist when people were first studying Stonehenge. Anthropology didn't exist, and astronomy wasn't even on the scene. So Hawkins was very controversial. There's a documentary about his work that you can find on YouTube. And Hawkins said that it's a computer. Well, I'm not convinced about that. But what Hawkins did notice that should have been noticed before is that there are some basic alignments. And the basic alignment, two basic alignments, are when you're standing out in the circle, and you look through the big sarsen stones to the south, it would be the southwest, you can at the winter solstice, when the sun sets at the winter solstice, it sets between those big sarsen stones. And that's famous, and everybody has seen this image of the sun setting through the sarsen stones. Now, I believe this is theatrics. I believe that this has no value in solstice observations for a few reasons. One is that I assume people were there in prehistoric times to watch the sun setting at the winter solstice. And when they did so, they had to prepare to get there. Might have taken days, weeks to get there. Therefore, they had other means of knowing when the winter solstice was beyond this movement of the sun setting through the window of the sarsen stones. So this can't be used to determine the winter solstice because people they must have known when the winter solstice was. There's many ways to do that, such as following the stars. They would have known what stars appeared 10, 20, how many lunations before the winter solstice. Now there's also the summer solstice observance, and the summer solstice observance is when you're standing in the middle of the monument and you're looking northeast. And looking northeast, you will see the sunrise at the sunrise at the summer solstice. And again, I believe that they saw this, and that's why they put the heel stone there. But to be there for this moment and have your ceremonial traditions, you had to know that it was going to happen in the future. And my bet is they used the stars. Okay. And the summer solstice celebration at Stonehenge is usually more widely visited than the winter solstice, because the winter solstice at Stonehenge, it's horrible weather. It's really nasty weather at that time in southern United Kingdom, whereas summer solstice, the weather's it's warm, it's a little cooler in the morning, and it's very pleasant. And that's the picture that people usually see of the sunrise. And if you look through that window there, you can see the sunrise, and you can see just to the bottom left of it, the heel stone peeking up there. And I've not been there for the summer or the winter solstice. I visited in, if I remember correctly, it was July. It was wonderful nonetheless. Now here's the problem with all the other alignments, is that in a circle, you can find anything. And that's problematic from an archaeology or archaeoastronomy standpoint, is how do you prove anything? Well, I believe that one could say that the summer solstice sunrise is valid because you have that heel stone to the northeast. And I believe that through the big sarsen stones, you can see the winter solstice sunset. And I think those are truly valid observations of astronomy. I think that anything anybody else finds at Stonehenge or believes they find is purely numerology, because they can't prove it. And that's the problem with circles. Okay. Now Stonehenge has its own history, of course, called modern or recent history, and the stones had actually fallen down, and they were in mounds. They were in human mounds. This is 1885. This is just after First World War. Someone took a shot from an airplane, because there were then airplanes. You can see that the stones were not in the position that they are in today. And archaeologists say, well, they were put back into position. And when they were put back into position, how do we really know that they were put into the correct place? It's a good question. It's a very good question. If we go back, you can see the big sarsen stones, and I'm okay with the winter solstice as it is, and the heel stone being, we can't see in this picture, with that alignment. I'm good with that. But again, with the other stones, how do you really know? People have these very fine alignments of stars and the moon and so on, But these stones have been moved, and the archaeologists who generally don't like astronomy, they're right in this case. We don't really know because the stones have been moved. Now the archaeologists are the ones who moved them. So if there's any mistake count the archaeologists. Now there are many standing stones in the United Kingdom, and they're all different. And they don't have the same alignments through the so-called heel stone and the sarsen stones at Stonehenge, and that's a problem. So one would think that if this was such a big the United Kingdom, you'd have some semblance of alignments other than circles. Because a circle, you can't tell anything, because people could make up anything they want about a circle, and people have over time. People said they're made by giants and all kinds of things, and so the stylistic difference throughout the United Kingdom. So the concept of the Stonehenge being or stone circles in the United Kingdom being the same thing is fairly, there's no evidence to support that. So this is the map of all the stone circles in the United Kingdom. There's an awful lot of them, all those little red dots, okay? And they're different. I should say, I don't believe that, my understanding is that none of them like Stonehenge, but the other ones, they're standing stones and circles. You really can't tell anything archaeoastronomy from those standing stones. So is Stonehenge numerology past the winter solstice and the summer solstice? You can count those, the blue stones and the sarsen stones and the Aubrey holes, and you can come up with anything you want. But when people come up with this numerology or these numbers that align, they say align to things. So maybe they do align to things, the stars and the sun and so on. But so what? What did they do with it? And there's no evidence that people have provided that I've seen that they have anything to do with, just besides the winter summer solstice. Now Stonehenge is on an avenue, and one can actually walk that avenue. The avenue is it goes through farmers' fields, and under British law, anything prehistoric, you're allowed to walk on the avenue. So you have to hop over a few fences. You walk through a driving range for pheasant hunters, and you can see how that avenue goes down to the river. It's quite a long road. I don't think my friend and I, Ian, who illustrated this image, he and we walked down the avenue, and there's no signs to help you to walk down that avenue. It's clearly you're on your own, and we used a compass. It goes down to the river, and we went down to the river, and we saw someone fishing. It wasn't this fellow fishing, but we can see this fellow had been there previously. And Paul is a very successful salmon fisherman. And in one image he's got a 28-pound salmon, another image he's got a 35-pound salmon. So one would think that salmon might have been pretty important to these people. Look at all that food. It's a lot easier to catch salmon than it is to farm for agriculture. It's so much easier to catch salmon, to harvest salmon. So one of my hypotheses is that Stonehenge was about the salmon. So why would anybody need Stonehenge for the salmon? And this is illustrated by Ian, my friend, who traveled with me. It's always nice to have it illustrated with you because you can create things that don't really exist. And so we're going to look at some of Ian's images as we go for a few minutes. And we had two fellows that helped us in our research. John Slater, who was a fishing guide on the river, and David Solomon, who was a biologist. And we walked along the river, we went fishing, we talked, and they showed us all the unique sort of things. And we looked at the river and we figured, well, they didn't have fishing rods, and they probably had some sort of spear. And they probably created weirs, they put rocks and such to create areas that the salmon would have to stop. And on the Hampshire Avon River right now, there's many pools that are created by humans creating so these little weirs, and they create pools so that this fish, or in this case in the trout, stay in these areas so people can fish for them. And there's private fishing clubs, and to be able to go to one of these 5 private fishing clubs, you have to be a member or a guest. In our case, it was David Solomon. He took us through his system. Now, there also probably might have had nets, or in this case, we have eel traps. And they probably harvest eels in the same way they'd harvested salmon. And this is on the test river, the Hampshire Avon. But you would have had this. There are people still trap eels on the Hampshire Avon River. So it is a thing. Eels are very good food. They come in large numbers, and they can be predictable. Now, the Hampshire Avon runs down to the bay into the ocean ultimately. It goes past the Salisbury Cathedral. What's quite interesting is that the Salisbury Cathedral, it's a massive cathedral, is oriented. If you're standing at the pews, and let's call it the high altar, to the main altar from the pews, you're looking directly east, and you see 3 windows. And at the equinox, the sun will rise directly through that center window. And before and after the equinoxes, the sun will rise through those other 2 windows to the left and right. This is obviously oriented. This is not by accident. The stonemasons who built Salisbury Cathedral had concepts of time and space, in the same way that I would say that the Stonehenge builders had. So traditions carry on when they're useful. Outside of the Salisbury Cathedral, there's a sundial, a very old sundial. I don't know if that's 1749, but is it a very old sundial that people go to look, and you can see how people mark time and space on the sundial. We also visit outside of Salisbury, this area. We stayed at a cottage, and the cottage had its own, or the community for the cottage had its own church, and outside the church was this sundial, a very simple sundial that people could have used, and they might have used the marks on the stones to tell time, but it was in fact a sundial. And then we went down to the harbor at Christ Church, where of course is a church, Christ Church, and we met this fellow who is a commercial salmon fisherman. I'm sure he's no longer with us, because he was probably in his 60s at that time, maybe late 60s. His name was Mike Park, and Mike Park is also a doyen. A doyen is a person who's an expert. So people would go to the doyen, go to Mike, and say, "Hey, Mike, how's the salmon? How's this about the river and such?" He was the expert. He was the guru. He was the spiritual leader of sorts. And we asked Mike about when he fishes for salmon. He says he fishes for salmon every day, but he knows when the salmon will be more prolific. He knows when to expect more salmon than other days. And based on expecting more salmon than other days, he would contract with the local restaurant and say, "I'm expecting some big salmon today. Put salmon on the menu, and prepare for a feast." Okay. And we'll get, how could Mike know that? We're going to get there in a minute. And here's an image or illustration from Ian as he believes Stonehenge as it once was. It's probably pretty accurate. And it's almost, I like traveling with Ian, because not only is he a fun guy to hang out with, but he illustrates everything. He does a really good job. He catches the nuances. So was there an Atlantic salmon connection to Stonehenge? Mike Parker thinks so, of course, because his life is about salmon. But in the archaeology space, it wasn't that people don't talk about this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to North America, to Northern California, not so far away from where I live. And we go to the Uruk Indians, because from my perspective is that if you want to learn about salmon fishing in the UK, or at least how people would have done it a long time ago, go look at indigenous peoples around the world. In this case, how did the Uruk Indians catch salmon? And we're going to give the case of steelhead trout, which is very similar to our salmon. And what they did is they built a fish dam. And they built this fish dam. Everybody got together to do this. It was a massive community works project, okay? A public works project. It was called the Keppel Fish Dam. And they built it in a very timely manner, and was utilized 6 new moons after the winter solstice. So 5 new moons after the winter solstice, people sort of got together, gathered and collected supplies, and through that whole lunation, that lunar month, they built this Keppel Fish Dam, and they used it to catch salmon, or in this case, actually, the steelhead trout. But it was a huge project, and they counted for the winter solstice 6 new moons. Now I know for a fact that the Indians in this region knew the winter solstice by the stars that preceded the winter solstice. I know that for a fact because I've heard it from the Indians in the region. And I've written on this concept of lunar timekeeping. We did a presentation a few months back. That was a lot of fun. I've written papers, I've written books, many presentations around the world. It's sort of my thing. I was probably the first one to bring this forward as a concept into the archaeology space, maybe even the archaeoastronomy space, in terms of tying it to the actual animals and the biology of the animals. But I didn't invent any of this. I didn't discover any of it. This all came from the indigenous peoples. They had it in their traditions. And I call this biological time. And so we're going to go, the Uruk Indians, just for the record, are in Northern California. And you can see where that is in the United States. And six new moons. Now, going into just north of California is Oregon, where I live, and north of Oregon is the state of Washington. And there's a hatchery, and there's a and they count the steelhead, that some winter steelhead that come up every year. They go out every day and they check the counts, and one can see that the steelhead have their low points around the full moon or the light nights, and they have the high points around the dark nights. And so it would make sense for if the steelhead trout are migrating upriver from the ocean, and you're going to build a fish dam or a weir as the Uruk did in California, it would make sense to have it at the new moon. I mean, it is perfectly obvious if you're an indigenous person. It has come not obvious at all if you were a fish and wildlife biologist prior to making these graphs, because they never looked at the moon. It wasn't their thing. And we're going to look at coho salmon in Oregon, and I've traveled to this river, and these are spawning coho salmon. You can see the kite how it on the mouth, on the upper lip, and around the full moon, these coho salmon, they spawn, so they're all together. They group together, and they drop their eggs. The female drops her egg, and the males fertilize the eggs. But they're not moving. They're not moving any between time up and down the river. They're in the same spot. So they're migrating up during the dark of the moon, and they're spawning at the light of the moon. So at the light of the moon would be a very good time to go out there into the spawning areas and spear them. But it would not be a very good time for fish traps, because they wouldn't be moving through fish traps. And in France, there's this engraved salmon, and you can look towards its mouth, and it's hyped. So this is a spawning salmon. This is near the Lascaux cave. You see 13 marks. If you count 13 days or nights from the first crescent moon, you're at the first full moon when you would have spawning salmon. So this is probably the same. It's probably the same thing, that the spawning salmon are there at the full moon, and that was telling them when it was. Oh, by the way, in this particular image, you see it looks like it's cut out. Someone tried to steal this artifact from the wall, but they weren't successful because the rock was too deep, and you can see the drill holes. The rock was too deep. Okay. So what did the Hampshire Avon Greater Stonehenge watershed look like? I say that they had fishing weirs up and down the system, which is that's my bet. Okay. Now I've said that the salmon are lunar times, both solar and lunar time, but it's actually all the animals in the food stream. The fish eat invertebrates, the insects, and birds eat the fish, and all that sort of stuff. And we can look at the insect drift or movement in a river. And this was done in Oregon by Norm Anderson, who I met years ago at Oregon State University. And he did work with his students, and they found that the invertebrates or the insects were migrating more prolifically at the dark of the moon, and there's very little migration during the full moon. And he looked at a number of different, they examined or collected a number of different insects. This is not just fish, this is salmon, it's insects too. And it's also land birds. And this study was done in California, and they found that the arrival and departure decreased with moonlight in the fall. And they found no relationship with the weather. Most people say that migration of birds are earlier to the weather. It's not true, based on this study. And we can go to the central part of the United States, or actually the central part of Canada in this case, for the Cree Indians. The Cree Indians, their lunar calendar, is about migrating birds. So they were collecting or harvesting the birds as well as the eggs from the birds, and that created their entire calendar. Okay. Among the Lakota, which are very famous, of Sitting Bull, who fought the battle and won the battle of the Bighorn, their calendar starts when the ducks come back, and then following that they have many lunations of different animals and plants. Okay. There's a conflict of time in this whole thing. There are 29 and a half days in a lunar cycle of light and dark. 12 times 29 and a half is 11 days short. So if the moon when the ducks came back was let's say January 10th one year, or January 11th one year, it would be January 1st the next year. And that's why the animals migrate earlier or later from one year to the next. Okay. It's because the moon the animals are timed to both the sun and the moon, which are out of sync with each other, and so that sets the migrations off every year. It's not because of the weather. And so there's a cycle of this, and the cycle is 19 years, with 235 lunar months. So the full moon, hypothetically, will return to January 1st, or let's say the winter solstice. The full moon will return to the winter solstice every 19 years. And between those 19 years, it'll shift around. The time repeats itself between the sun and the moon every 19 years, and that's called the metonic cycle. Now, I went to this river many years ago. It's called the Restigouche. It's up in the eastern side of Canada, in the province of New Brunswick. And this is 19. You see this image? That's not me. That was 1907. This fellow caught a lot of salmon. We didn't catch any salmon, and caught a lot of salmon. Well, it's very interesting that we can look back at the salmon actually have cycles, and the cycles are very close to a half. They're a half metonic cycle. So every 19 years, 19 years, you have a metonic cycle, and every 10 years, or actually 9.5 years, you have a half metonic cycle. And the salmon have that same migration pattern. In this case, I have a graph. That the graph was previously made, and I added the full moon. That this is the first full moon after the winter solstice. So if you follow the sun and you follow the moon, and over long periods of time, you could accurately gauge when there will be the peaks of abundance of salmon. And there's no reason that the people of Stonehenge could not have known this. They lived there for a very long period of time. We can see that they charted the sun. And I'm sure they charted the moon as well for these other planets and animals. Well, they also would have told they would have been able to see cycles of abundance in the salmon. And that fellow was back in 1907. We can see that he was at a peak in cycle. The reason he caught all those salmon is not because he was a great fisherman or he had a great guide. It's because he was at a peak in abundance for those salmon. And people at Stonehenge would have known the same thing. Well, there's 19 inner blue stones. Could they have been using those to mark the Metonic cycle? Possibly. Maybe they tied a rope around it. Maybe they put a rock against them. Did they use these to mark it? Quite possibly. It would have been, but it wasn't about the placement of the stones. It would have been another numerical counting device that you can't tell. So that's what I would say. I'd say that's what they did. That they used it as a counting device, but not a marker of time itself against the horizon of the sun, the moon, stars, that sort of stuff. Now, there's many other animals that have cycles. It's fairly common. And most of these animals are known by trappers, that they were, or the agencies regulate the trappers. So the trappers harvest snowshoe hare, and they have to report how many snowshoe hare they harvested. And so there's data over many decades of harvests, and we have these for many different animals. And the people at Stonehenge would have had the same thing as well. So is it numerology or a solar lunar counting device? Maybe it's a bit of both. Maybe they're using Stonehenge for that purpose. Very similar to the Europeans did, I should say, in California. It's no longer allowed to put dams to trap salmon or steelhead. Now, there was a very important purpose for this being a public works project of people getting together among the rooks, is that there are people who live upstream, and there's people who live downstream, and there's people who live in the middle. Everybody wanted to catch their salmon. So at this meeting, when they were building these dams, they said, well, the people downstream will catch salmon for 2 or 3 days, and then they'll break down their dam. And then the people mid-river will catch their salmon for 2 or 3 days, and then they'll break down their dam. And the people upstream will catch salmon for 2 or 3 days, and they'll break down their dam, which allowed for salmon to migrate through the whole system. Everybody could get salmon. Otherwise, they'd be fighting. But the Rook figured out that wasn't a good way to do it. And where I live, near the Columbia River Basin in Oregon, we have the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And these are all the tribes in the Columbia River Basin. They get together and they decide how many salmon are going to be let through the system at each stage. They decide how many salmon they will keep and how many salmon will, except the white commercial fishermen can harvest in their boats. Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, CRIFIC, they make these decisions. They get together in a meeting. And I spoke at the CRIFIC back in about 2004. And then all the members invited me to speak before their tribal councils and their local fish agencies. I traveled throughout the Columbia River Basin. I met the Indians, and I went to their salmon festivals and all these wonderful things, and it was a lot of fun. A lot of driving, but it was a lot of fun. But they get together to figure this stuff out. So we all in the United Kingdom, almost all of the rivers currently have salmon, and many of them, we can assume that all of them did have salmon in the past. And in colder oceans, salmons are more prolific, and now we have fairly warm oceans. There's not much salmon. But in the past, there was probably a lot of salmon, especially at the time of Stonehenge, when it was much colder than it is today, and the oceans were definitely colder. So were these all coordinated public work projects where people got together to decide who was going to get the salmon both upstream and downstream? Now, everybody can see the slide, right? Yes?
Yes, Ben.
Okay, good. Make sure. Okay. I haven't heard anybody in a while. Make sure you're all still out there. Okay. So going back to stone circles, the United Kingdom, there's an awful lot of them. There's a lot of salmon rivers. So I would say that Stonehenge was not just a coordinated project for the local area, but I'd say it was for a larger region as well, because it is probably the biggest megalithic site. And we find that the stones came from Wales, stones came from Scotland, and there's also many other monuments around the Stonehenge project that we didn't go into. And my bet is that Stonehenge was like the meeting place of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and where the Uruk Indians met up and down the rivers to coordinate the resources. Not salmon would have been a huge one, but other resources as well. So that people were not stepping on each other's toes. People were allowing the salmon and other animals to pass through for other tribes to utilize. And it just makes so much sense, because Stonehenge, these rocks, these huge stones, why would you carry them from all these other places if you're not connected somehow to the other places? You don't go to Scotland to steal a stone and then raft it down the aisle. And the same thing for all those blue stones. It just doesn't make any sense to me that they were acting independently. So after the Stonehenge, during the people of Stonehenge, they were agricultural, and they would have used it for agriculture as well, to coordinate resources, and also to talk, to bring to the people who knew what they were doing together in meetings to share the information. In the United States now, these are called Grange halls. Grange halls they're the oldest in any town. They are the oldest building. And on this map, you can see all the Grange halls throughout the state of Oregon. And in these Grange halls, they get together for community service, to raise money for the poor, sort of stuff. They have educational discussions in the same way the tribes do. They talk about best agricultural practices. They do ceremonial activities. They celebrate Christmas and all that sort of stuff. And they do networking. They have grassroots activism, so they lobby the governments for their causes, and they network and develop leadership. These are all the things one could have at Stonehenge, at the Stonehenge megalith, and other sites where people came together to learn, to share information, and to make sure that they were sharing resources. Because at the Grange halls, they also share resources. They share the resource, they discuss the water, because water is a very critical for agriculture, and they discuss who's going to get how much water, how do we conserve water. It's part of the deal. So everybody thinks of Stonehenge as the big megalith. Well, I believe there was a reason for that. I believe at points in time, it was the main meeting place where people came together to the United Kingdom. And then they went back to their own stone circles, and they shared the information of what they had learned. Very similar to people do today. Everybody comes out to Stonehenge, not everybody, but a lot of people go to Stonehenge to watch the summer solstice sunrise, just beyond the Heelstone. But they come to share, they come to celebrate, they come to network, they come to talk about the year, all that sort of stuff. So in summary, my summary slide. The megalith stones in the UK do not follow a consistent solar or stellar orientation pattern. They're different, and they're definitely not all winter solstice markers or summer solstice markers. It's just not. You can't prove it because there's no. At Stonehenge, you can tell by the north and south with the heel stone and the large sarsen stones, but most of the other stones don't have anything. They're circles of stones. So in the building of Stonehenge, and as well as all these megalith sites, they're coordinated peoples, and I would say for Stonehenge across the United Kingdom. And without any doubt, Stonehenge was a gathering place for people to communicate and coordinate natural resources. And I would say the emphasis is on Atlantic salmon. And the reason is that Atlantic salmon travel up the rivers, and they also travel down the rivers as well after they spawn. But when they travel up the rivers, the people downriver need to make sure they're getting enough salmon, but not too much, so that the people upriver will get their fair share. It's very important. Just as we have for salmon in the west coast of the United States today, the tribes coordinate this. Okay? And I would say that all these other standing stone circles in the UK were likely public works projects as well. And that is I'm going to stop sharing. I get to get some questions. So first of all, when I do these presentations, I'm sure everybody is noticing that I'm going to speak about something that nobody even thought I was going to speak about. Is that about right?
Exactly, Brian. I think thank you very much for something very newly informative details to share with our Astronomy Inc students. Because I think I'm also a little bit confused, I never heard in even the articles and anything, because of previously that we have been heard that the Stonehenge was originally established for understanding the celestial spheres, stars and other constellations. So that is what we thought, but based on your project, that I feel it's truly enough to get too much more knowledge about. Yes, of course, even Stonehenge is highly important to connect some biological data, like even the animals, trees and other life cycles with the celestial constellations. It's something very new thing. Thank you very much, Bernie. Dear students, now we are opening to the Q&A session. This is completely new, and make sure to remember today's session was optional one, and it's completely new, and that's why on behalf of the astrobiology and paleontology programs, and you have some opportunities to listen to some tremendous explorations which is regarding the archaeoastronomy. Everyone knows about the Stonehenge, which has been just established in United Kingdom. So Bernie, I have a couple of questions. Dear students, if you have further questions, and make sure to raise your hand. I can see Danmita, Devmina, Bonukar, Hasidu and Netupar and Tiveng. There are a couple of students also there. So the first question is why originally Stonehenge have been established on variations people in United Kingdom? What is the main purpose, as you think?
I think it was to coordinate the resources. I think that before Stonehenge, people were coordinating the resources just as the Uruk were doing in Northern California, but they didn't have a Stonehenge. But then they felt that they needed to coordinate over a wider region, and they brought the stones together, coordinating to say, this is our monument, this is our place, this is where we're going to get together, in the same way people do today for public buildings. Whether it be a church or a courtroom or a government building or a temple, a mosque, people build together for a place of common community. So I believe they knew when the winter solstice was. Obviously, they knew what it was, right? Because they arrived there for the party, just as we arrived for the summer solstice party you see in these images. Nobody was watching the sun to go to that summer solstice party. They looked at a calendar. And the people of this time period would have known the stars as they rose on the horizon, the first horizon, the heliotic horizon, and how many days, those specific stars counting to the winter solstice or the summer solstice and other days. You do not follow. When I visited Stonehenge, we weren't up early in the morning, but it was cloudy. It was cloudy. And the Salisbury Plain is also a very cloudy place. It's just what it is, especially in the wintertime. It's to catch a winter solstice sunset is pretty rare because of the clouds. They were not using, it was ceremonial. They knew it was going to happen. People came from long distances to celebrate.
Okay, that sounds very interesting. It means they have been already know in which time period that the fish and other animals were traveling around into that area. So by coordinating to that astronomy. So like why you specifically highlighting the salmon fish? Why not other animals and other things?
Oh, so the reason for the salmon was that I had the data on salmon. I had many years of data on salmon, and that was work I did about 2000, 2001, 2002. And I was the first one to show that the adult salmon were lunar timed. No one, the Indians knew this. They all knew this, right? But while biologists had no idea, absolutely no clue, because nobody had ever looked at the data, and they said, well, it was always the weather, that sort of stuff. It's not the weather. So I had many years of data to draw from. And it wasn't my data, it was the Fish and Wildlife Agency, so I didn't make up the data. But I also had data for different parts of the salmon's life. I had salmon as they came into the rivers, as they moved up the rivers, as they spawned and they left the rivers, and the juveniles that came from the eggs that went out to the ocean. So I had many different stages of the salmon. And I recognized that it was like walking a stairs, and each step led to the next step. So if they migrated during the dark of the moon, they would, in a short river, they migrated during the dark of the moon, they would spawn during the full moon. Just one leads to another. Very simple. And it was just huge amounts of data that had been collected and not utilized for these purposes. And then there's books about all these other animals, the hares and the mink, and that they're typically 4-year cycles or 4.5-year cycles. So they're half of the 9-year cycle, right? Okay. But that goes back for hundreds of years, this sort of data, and all the trappers know that. And people at Stonehenge would have known all this as well, and they would have watched these cycles for abundance, and not only to coordinate resources within we'll call them tribes, they're probably tribes, but they also would have known what are the good years to have kids. Okay? If you know it's going to be a real low year in salmon, it wouldn't be a good idea to push for the propagation of children, to have more children, because there's a lot less food. Whereas you're going into the higher years, you say, well, there's a lot of food. There's going to be a lot of food. Let's party, let's expand, let's explore, let's do all these things. We have lots of leisure time that you had to be very careful about during the low years of the salmon. So if someone could have said, if the full moon fell on the winter solstice in year 6, we're going to have terrible times. People would say, well, that's astrology today. But if you look at the salmon, that's not astrology. Look at the migration, the timing, the abundance of the salmon. It's not astrology at all. And on the Restigouche River in Canada, to fish the river, you have to belong to a club. And so you've paid for your whole life to belong to this club. But you have to show up every year, otherwise you lose your spot. So they go out there during the low years. There's nobody catches the salmon. They drink beer in the canoes, and they party at nighttime. They know they're not going to catch a salmon. They know they're not going to catch a salmon for 6 or 7 more years. They absolutely know. And so you can predict the future, and you'd be much more successful by doing so. But most importantly, I believe all these were community works projects to make sure there was peace among the tribes, the upstream and the downstream tribes, to coordinate the resources, but people weren't fighting with each other all the time. Which when white people arrived in North America, the Indians had all this figured out, and they still have it to this day.
So while I was just talking with many of astronomers and archaeoastronomers in Europe, most of people said like development or astronomical instrument to understand celestial sphere object. But today I understood with your explanation, it's not only for the celestial constellations and celestial sphere, to resource management. That is something very key point. Because of resources means not only the fish, even the agriculture, even the development of sustainability in the previous kingdom. So, and also Bernie, is there any connectivity to agriculture development on behalf of that Stonehenge?
So possibly, I never proved. Well, during the period of Stonehenge, they were agricultural, okay, but just like agricultural people also hunt and fish, right? So they were agricultural society, that foundation. But they also wouldn't coordinate resources. People would have harvested around the full moons because more people can get together to harvest into the evening and to transport their the grains. So that would have been coordinated around the sun and the moon as well. But again, people, I believe, it's all about coordination. Now, people say that Hawkins, that Stonehenge was this computer to see the stars. You don't need Stonehenge to see the stars. Nobody in this Teams chat has a Stonehenge to see the stars. We walk out of the house and we can see the stars. You don't need a Stonehenge to see the stars, okay? And I don't. Hawkins was brilliant, and he brought astronomy to archaeology and kicked off everything that we know about archaeoastronomy. Hawkins was the guy, but he wasn't right about everything. And so we do have I see a raised hand.
Yeah. So I noticed that Netupa and raising the hand. Netupa, go ahead. Ask your question.
How far has the procession of the equinox moved the procession of the summer solstice on the horizon since the time Stonehenge was built?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm not sure how much far the sun has. The stars have the greater movement precession of the equinox. It's 26,700 years, something like that, right? Or 25,700 years. So people have. I have software I could do this. I use this public domain software. Archaeoastronomers have looked at Stonehenge from that perspective, and they say that they're based on their knowledge and their software. They're saying that it's very close to the same spot that you would see it today over these 5,000 years, right? It's not that actually. How many years was it? 4,000 years. 4,000 years. It hasn't moved that far in these few thousands of years, so the alignments would be the same. But you could test that question for yourself through there's a public domain archaeoastronomy program that you can dial back to the time of Stonehenge, and you can see, over every hundreds of years how far it has moved. But it hasn't moved based on the people that have measured it. It hasn't moved very far. Now, the people that measured it, they've also gone to other sites and they've written papers. And what the first thing they learned was that they all have different alignments in these stone circles. If you could even find an alignment, they all have different alignments. So these things probably weren't used for the purpose of determining when the winter solstice and the summer solstice was, because they're just not the same. But that is the perception. Everybody knows that Stonehenge marks the winter and the summer solstice, and so they project that all the other stone circles in the UK, you saw those little dots, they all do the same thing, but in fact they don't at all. And so the archaeoastronomers scratch their head about Stonehenge. It's obviously not by accident that the heel stone marks the summer solstice sunrise. That's not by accident. It's not by accident that the sarsen stones, the sun sets through the winter solstice. Okay. It's not by accident. But that doesn't mean that it is a celestial device.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting, Ben. Even like if you go back to the 5,000 years, like I'm pretty sure that the Polaris is not the northern star. So again, if you go back to the again like 10,000 or 14,000, so even northern star gonna be changed. So that's why even the alignment will be completely different if you go back to the, as you said, like until 25,000 years. So it's quite something like it's super hard, even like how those people have been just understood this type of alignment before 5,000 years ago. That's tremendous. And even what you are mentioning on today, it's the management of the resources. That's going to be something like new domain too. Even we have to understood those things. And Netupa, I hope like you have got your answer. Again, I seen Hasindu have been raising the hand. Yes, Hasindu? Go ahead.
Sir, does this Stonehenge site have mythological significations? Because I have seen this place in magical stories.
Yeah. The answer is yes, of course. I'm going to tell you, we have a Stonehenge not so far from me. There was an American who went to Stonehenge after World War I. And this American built highways out of concrete. And at that time, after World War I, people were saying that it was a monument to the deceased in the wars of the past. Okay? Because there was no astronomy at that time. It was a monument to the deceased. So he built a Stonehenge replica not so far from me. He built it out of concrete because he built highways. He had a lot of concrete. Okay. So that became his mythology. Before him, people would say that the Druids say that it was giants. Okay. But that only giants could have built it, because who else could move these big stones? You must have had giants. Yes, there's the mythology. So mythologies are projections of the human consciousness. And we have mythologies that we can go back for tens of thousands of years in cave art. We can see the characters. And we can see interconnection between the horse and the man and the lion and these animals. So people have always had mythologies as part of who we are. And we project them from our minds. But do we know the mythology of the people at Stonehenge? Well, my bet it had something to do with salmon. Okay, because in the Columbia River Basin here, the mythologies circle around the salmon. There's other characters, but they all involve the salmon at their core. Because I believe you saw how big those salmon were, and how easy they would be to catch if you had a weir, a dam, sort of a dam. And there would have been stories of other animals that connected with the salmon. But we don't have for fact anything for the makers of Stonehenge, their mythology. We have the story of the giants from the Druids, and King Arthur's stories connect to this. But then they're not so long ago. But that is it's tough to find a mythology in stone when nobody has discovered any visible images. But that's a very good question. That's an important question.
Vasantu, I hope you received your answer.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, welcome. And if there are any questions available, make sure to raise in your hand. And also, Bernie, what do you think about that sundial? Can we consider Stonehenge also as a sundial? What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure if the right word is sundial. Because with a sundial, you have a gnomon, and then you have cast a shadow. So I don't know if the right word would be a sundial. Okay, but clearly the winter solstice and summer solstice. I saw someone give a presentation. I've seen a lot of presentations about Stonehenge, and there's a lot of ideas out there, and some of them are very good ideas. And one person in a presentation said that the henge could have been filled with water, and that they were looking at the reflection of the stars on the water in the henge. And I thought that was interesting, because I never heard that. And she showed a picture. She went out at nighttime and she took a picture of the stars in the henge, in the water, floating in the water. So the answer is there's probably many things we don't know. I'm sure there's many things we don't know. But I'm pretty convinced that this was about management of resources, that people all came together to share information and to make sure there was peace up and down the rivers. There have also been migrating deer at that time, red deer. And that the reason why we have stones from faraway places, Wales and Scotland, is that these people were connected. And they brought together what was important to them to the central church or temple or synagogue, whatever you want to call it, but the central place of communication with the great beyond.
So even while we're considering about the development of Stonehenge, you've seen that the shape of the aerial view is something like circular. Not only the Stonehenge, even if you've seen some Scotland, some structured, And USA, even in Sri Lanka, if you could remember one of our projects in Danigal,
Yes.
it's almost like a circular. So why did circular structure that much interacted with the human?
Well, there's different ways to look at that. In mythology, people who study mythology, which goes to psychology, say that the circle is wholeness. And if we look at Stonehenge, we have the winter solstice and we have the summer solstice line, and they're the turns of the year. And so we have the wholeness of the year, okay? The wholeness of time between the two. And so I would say that it's the wholeness of the celestial sphere and time. But that doesn't mean that they're using it to know when the stars were to rise, because they already knew when the stars were going to rise. And so I would say it would be the wholeness, the psychological wholeness of the year and the turns. And this is a religious concept. So I grew up in the United States, obviously, which is a Judeo-Christian country. And Judeo-Christian belief is that there's a beginning and there's an end, okay? And that there's a birth and then there's a death, whether that be in the individual or the religion or time itself. There was a great creation, and there'll be the end of the world, the apocalypse. And this is in our psyche as Americans. We can't escape from this. As Native Americans, it's all circular time. That it never begins, it never ends, it just goes through cycles. Which is a completely different concept. I remember I lived in China for 4 years, and they would always say that Americans were trying to finish things. They're always in a rush to get things. And they would say, well, we're going to be late. We're late. And the Chinese would say, you won't be late. Time is eternal. There is no end. You can never be late for anything. Time is eternal. And so that's probably Confucian, isn't it? You've probably heard that sort of thing. So the concept of circular time is found among what's called indigenous peoples throughout the world. And that there is no beginning, there is no end. Time just continues on in circles. Whereas in Judeo-Christian traditions, we clearly have, there's a creation and there's an apocalypse, the end of things. It's part of our psyche. We can't escape from it, the end of times. And I say white people in North America and perhaps in Europe, people, they pray for the end of time. What's going to happen? What do we do to prepare for the end of time? That at the end of time, there'll be nothing else. And so, will I see my parents again? All this sort of stuff. What good deeds should I do to make sure that I'm in the right place at the end of time? But it's part of our psyche as Westerners, as North Americans, and perhaps Europeans as well.
Yeah, even in Asia, there is no such a difference. So my final and last questions to you, when will you going to release your new book regarding the Stonehenge?
Well, I wrote half the book. I wrote it back in 2005. Then I realized I was rewriting my biological time book. So about half of what we discussed today, we had presented in the biological time presentation a few months ago. And so I decided that, do I want to spend my time rewriting the books over and over again with each place? And I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go do different things. My daughter at that time was, she was 1 or 2 years old. So I said, I'm going to raise my daughter. And then I'll come back to this concept later. And I did come back to these concepts back in 2014, about 10 years later. And that's when I started the Before Orion project. And the Before Orion project started with this biological time stuff. And then I stumbled upon the astronomy, the constellations, and the cave art, and I went off in a different direction. So I'm glad I took those 10 years off to raise my daughter, who this week is graduating graduate school. And so life is good, do different things, learn from others, try different directions, because it's everything that comes together that makes the whole. To be an expert in one thing is not an expert at all, but rather one has to listen to all these different perspectives. And the archaeologists who work at Stonehenge, they probably don't even know there's salmon in the river, or that people still harvest eels with traps. They have absolutely no idea. It's not part of their view. And so they will say, well, they'll have all these different interpretations that have no fact to the reality on the ground.
Yeah, again, I noticed that Hasindu is raising the hand. Hasindu, still you have any questions?
Sir, I have one question. In what ways are Sakalchakra and Stonehenge similar terms of astronomy historical signification?
So there's Stonehenge, and what was the other one?
So he's talking about something available in Sri Lanka.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know what Stonehenge is? The historical significance of Stonehenge is that everybody here knew about Stonehenge before the poster was put up. Everybody knew. It is a national monument in the United Kingdom that people all around the world identify the United Kingdom with. And even though Göbekli Tepe is 8,000 years older, right? Was it 6,000 years older? Okay. People still think of Stonehenge as the big megalith in the world. And even though the Great Pyramid at Giza is so much bigger, huge and monumentally bigger than Stonehenge, people still revere Stonehenge. You have to realize the difference in size between the Giza Pyramid and Stonehenge. It took hundreds of thousands of more man hours to build the Giza Pyramid than it did Stonehenge. And they're in the same time period. But people don't realize that they're in the same time period. So the Giza period is so much more significant. People don't realize that the megaliths at Malta are older than Stonehenge. But most people don't even know there are megaliths at Malta, and there's many of them. Okay, and many of them have been suggested to have stellar and solar lunar orientations. But no, very few people know about that. So Stonehenge historical significance is that it is possibly the most important symbol of the United Kingdom outside of the monarchy, the king and the queen. It's what everybody knows about the United Kingdom. And that's why it remains important. There are hundreds of other stone circles, as you saw in that image, but how many people know that? How many could you name besides Avebury is nearby Stonehenge? Okay, so everybody knows that one. Most people know that one. But who could name two more? Okay. So historical significance of Stonehenge, it is truly a symbol of the United Kingdom. And so many people go to visit Stonehenge to be there. I'm actually going to be there in the second week of January next year. I'll be at Stonehenge.
That sounds very interesting.
But there's probably more interesting monuments in Sri Lanka. Older monuments. Okay.
Yeah. That's exactly true. Even that's what Hasidhu also mentioned, like Sakula Chakra also representing some of like engraving symbol, most probably like aquatic animals based on the archaeological science. Of course, like we need some comparative analysis in the future. So you'll see, like as you said, like there are a lot of circles over there, but we know only few. Dominant one is a Stonehenge.
It's Stonehenge.
Yeah, that's exactly true. Okay, dear students, and today we have enjoyed very much, and this is very informative and very diversified lecture. Thank you very much, dear Bernie, your time and the devotion since last 6 years. So you are just providing such outstanding knowledge to the South Asian students. Thank you very much for all your contributions to the Archaeoastronomy Inc. And dear students, I'm going to wind up today's sessions, and we are going to see you at the next week. If you have any kind of further question, please send in us to our WhatsApp group. Then I can just provide those questions to the Bernie. Thank you very much, Bernie, and have a great day.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah.